Welcome on behalf of CTE. Welcome to our spring colloquium. Delighted to see so many people here. I hope you will sympathize with the conundrum I face, and that is, how do you introduce a legend? And I decided by speaking very briefly and sitting down. So that's what I'm going to do. Lee Shulman, as you all know, is the Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at School of Education. He's the President Emeritus of Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching. He's a former Graumeyer Award winner, the inventor of pedagogical content knowledge, which is one of the buzzwords of the day over the past 30 years. But beyond that, he's an incredibly fertile mind, a searching seeker of truth, a professional teacher's teacher, an advocate for teachers, an advocate for education, all-around wise, smart man, raconteur, and as you'll find out today, provocateur. Please welcome Lee Shulman.
He's also a Cubs fan.
I'm also a Cubs fan, and it's just as satisfying now as it has been for the last century.
I wanted to keep the controversy out of it.
Alas, there's no controversy about the Cubs. I just said to Mike Atkin that he's the reason I'm here, because I came in 1982 from Michigan State when Mike was dean, and it was one of those rare times when the dean had to make a recommendation for appointment against a majority vote of the faculty. But you did it, Mike, and thank you. And I also should acknowledge Larry Cuban, who had me as his, he said I was his student teacher or teacher aide when the two of us taught together at Menlo Atherton High School, 11th grade U.S. history, 8 o'clock every morning in the fall semester of 1996. We then went back to our day job, which was teaching a course on teaching in the CNTE sequence, which we taught for the first time, and since I moved to the foundation right after that, the last time together. But I don't think I was really your teacher aide, Larry. I wasn't that much assistance. It was, it being the California curriculum for U.S. history, 11th grade started with the Civil War. And I think the first impression of the students in the class was to ask us what the war was really like. But I think, Larry, we achieved co-membership with the students in the class, so many of whom were the children of immigrants, when they learned that you and I were the children of immigrants. And that hadn't occurred to them. So that was fun. All right. Thank you all for coming. One of the sacrifices one makes when retiring is that you no longer teach regular classes where at the very least you have people who are obligated to listen to your thoughts for fear of what the consequences might be of not paying attention. Once you're emeritus, nobody has to listen to what you're thinking, which may be a sacrifice for the speaker, but provides great relief for those who otherwise might be assaulted by those thoughts. So thank you very much for being here. I see this as an informal opportunity to share ideas. It's in the spirit of a mode of communication that at the Carnegie Foundation we used to regularly call the exchange of sacrificial drafts. I recommend that idea very, very passionately to you. We put much too high stakes on anything we write, and we ought to develop a culture of sacrificial drafts. I think I first learned that phrase from John Bransford, who was then at Vanderbilt. I think he's now at University of Washington, isn't he? Yeah, when we were all doing research on communities of teachers and communities of learners. But anyway, I treat this as a sacrificial draft. And it's part of an ongoing concern I've had for many decades. And that is, how do we answer the question, what does educational research have to offer to the rest of the world? Especially the most important people in the world, those who actually teach, and the less important, but alas, often far too powerful people, those who set policies about what they ought to teach, or who oversee what they do as teachers. But what is it that we have to offer? And, what are we good for? And how does the work we do in schools of education, in which we ostensibly prepare people like the three generous folks who are going to comment on my comments as soon as I'm finished, what is it about how we prepare you that actually prepares you to be of any good to folks out there who rely on us for lots of stuff? And so I'd like to explore some of those ideas with you because although I've been wrestling with them for over 50 years, I'm not sure I'm that much smarter about them now than I was 50 years ago. The only thing that's different is I was much more confident in my answers 50 years ago. One of the things that happens as you get more and more veteran in this field is if you have even a shred of honesty, the level of your skepticism about how much you know does go up. I hope you're finding that in your faculty. And if you're not, ask them why. And I began my note to a number of you that Claude sent out a day before yesterday with this observation of Jerome Kagan's that he began an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education with a couple of years ago. As it happened, I take Jerome Kagan very seriously because in the very earliest years of my own career as a junior faculty member at Michigan State University, Jerry Kagan, who had just moved from Antioch to Harvard, a step down, but nevertheless an important one for him, was very instrumental in helping me along in my career. And so I've always paid close attention to him. And in this essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education, he begins with this quote that I sent out to you. Although the public's understanding of science is dominated by images of elegant machines and useful products, its two most basic rituals, and I don't think he means empty rituals, I think he means practices, are making observations and inventing concepts that might explain the evidence, the observations. And then he says, and in those pursuits, generalization can be insidious. Wow. I mean, generalization, for those of us trained in the social sciences, in education as disciplined inquiry, is the gold standard. It's what it is that we're supposed to seek all the time. What counts as real research is a contribution to knowledge. And contributions to knowledge are supposed to have a certain quality of generalizability beyond the particularities of the setting in which they are originally investigated. So what in the world could Kagan mean by that rather shocking assertion? I also want us to keep in mind, though I don't know that we're going to have time to explore it much this afternoon, his very lovely, simple definition of what science is all about. Making observations and coming up, and he uses the term inventing, concepts that make sense of the observations. And to the grad students here, I want to emphasize the notion of inventing concepts, not what I so often have heard over those 50 plus years. Someone coming into my office and saying, I need a conceptual framework to help me do X. And when my response is, well, damn it, invent one. They think I'm suggesting some unnatural or illegal act, when in fact it's the very essence of doing scholarship. So what does it mean? How do you know what to observe? Observing is not a simple task. What does it mean to observe? And what does it mean to invent concepts? Well, as I say, let's leave that one hanging a little bit. So for me, the story really begins when last spring I went and made a visit to the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, an institution that I had a hand in giving birth to on the 5th floor of CERUS about 25 years ago. And I was invited, along with my wife, Judy Shulman, to address the current members of the board about the history of the board, how it developed, why it developed, and what the principles underlying it were. And while there, I met a young man named Joe Doctor, just completing his EDD at Harvard under a new program that they had created that actually followed a model that we had developed at the Carnegie Foundation for the professional practice doctorate, for a real doctorate of practice, not the sort of thing that so often is called an EDD, which is a PhD light. In fact, a lot of PhDs are PhD lights, but let's not go into that right now. Some of them are also PhD heavies. It's hard to find the Goldilocks dissertation, which is just right, but we'll leave that with the questions of observation and explanation. And he told me about his capstone project. They don't call them dissertations. The capstone, which sort of brings to a close the years of doctoral study by integrating the variety of things they had done earlier. Arnitha Duquesne also has a professional practice doctorate, which is developed. Arnitha and I have a Duquesne connection. That's a university in Pittsburgh. The Pirates have won more pennants than the Cubs over the years. Are you a Pittsburgh person? Oh. It's one of America's best kept secrets. It's a lovely city. Okay. Anyway, I get distracted easily. I'm sorry. So he told me about what he had done, and then about 6 months later, he sent me a copy of what I will call the dissertation, the capstone project. But along with it, he wrote me a letter. And in the letter, he says, as I mentioned to you briefly, the subject of my capstone for my practice-based doctoral degree was the National Board. In particular, I analyzed the past year of change and strategy developments here, the role I played in that work. I dug into the history of the board and then related its forward-looking strategy and its development to that history. I'll note that it is a bit different from a typical dissertation. It's not original research, but rather an analysis of leadership practice. Well, I read the dissertation. I'm sorry, the capstone. I found it quite original. I found I learned a lot that I cared a lot about from reading it. It made me smarter about a part of the world I cared about. And when I was done with it, I wrote him a kind of peevish email. And I said, why the hell are you apologizing for this lovely piece of work, which added more to my knowledge than an awful lot of the dissertations that are ostensibly contributions to knowledge, stop apologizing. It's good stuff. But that got me thinking. And it got me thinking about what does it mean to make a contribution to knowledge, and why was this piece of work, which, considering that there are now over 100,000 board-certified teachers in America, and I was just in a day-long meeting in Ceres of a committee that's redesigning the board, that the current Charles Ducommun professor Linda Darling Hammond was chairing, and it may ultimately have an impact on 1 million teachers in America. Why is this somehow less of a contribution to knowledge? And so while I'm thinking about that, I come across a story in the most important peer-reviewed journal of the social sciences in the world, the New York Times. Well, other than Jon Stewart, more people get news from the New York Times than any other source. And depending upon the generation, no, it is Jon Stewart. Though Colbert has a new gig, and so we may have to watch that one too. I think we better give up 8 o'clock classes in the morning because the important stuff's happening at midnight. In any event, my wife has been on my case for over 50 years about how big a slob I am. And as big a slob as I am in general, in my study, it reaches a kind of pinnacle. It looks a little like a post-Katrina event. And so she called my attention to this story in the New York Times about a study that was published in a major peer-reviewed journal about the relationship between messy desks and creativity. Do some of you remember that story about 6 months ago? Did some of you have loved ones you wanted to assail with that story too? I don't know. And she said, you know, I guess what you've been saying may be true, because this was the report of an experiment. In fact, there were 2 experiments done at the University of Minnesota by a social psychologist in the business school, in which they created experimental situations in which a randomly assigned half of the sample, remember that story? Sat at messy desks or in the presence of them, and the other half of the sample sat in very neat environments, and then they gave them some standardized creativity test, and sure enough, the ones who sat at the messy desks scored higher. And I went back and on the net found the original published article, because I was interested in getting a little bit more information than even all the news that's fit to print had thought fit to print. And the conclusion was stated in pretty broad terms. Disorderly environments seem to inspire breaking free of tradition, Dr. Vose and her co-authors conclude in the study, which can produce fresh insights. Well, the study had been done in an experimental setting, not in anybody's office, with a group of 30 undergraduates, not clear who they were, where she found them. Maybe she offered free lunch, I don't know. Randomly assigned 15 to a group, and they actually did the experiment twice. So that was where the subjects came from. That was as far as the description of the settings went, and the creativity tests were some pretty old ones about the multiple uses. You know, how many uses can you find for a clothespin? And Shelley, you remember those studies. You read about them when you were a grad student. I remember when they were done. So I thought to myself, look, as much as it gives me a sense of solace and consolation to find some reason to justify the chaos of my study. In what sense is this article published in a peer-reviewed journal? And for all I know, a couple of the grad students who worked with her used pieces of this research as their PhD dissertations. Julie, that sounds reasonable? Yeah, okay. To what extent is that more of a contribution to knowledge than what Joe Doctor did in his study of the National Board and its strategic development? And indeed, the findings, the conclusions are stated in these broad, general terms, right? Disorderly environments, doesn't even say messy desks, you know? Disorderly environments seem to inspire not doing well on a standardized but very old creativity test, but to inspire breaking free of tradition. Now, one of my favorite op-ed columnists, David Brooks, unfortunately falls into the trap of taking just this sort of study much too seriously in some of his columns. But I said, do I believe this study is generalizable to anything like me working in my study at 3 o'clock in the morning? Well, of course not. I don't. Does the study have any value? Perhaps, if I knew more about the students, more about what they were told the study was about. I mean, there was a lot I didn't know. How does it relate to the last 50 years of research on environments and the development of creativity? I don't know. I thought I did a good job just going back and finding the original article. But it seemed to me, in some ways, emblematic, symptomatic, exemplary of a broader question, which was, on what grounds do we who study, in my case, teaching and learning, but a lot of other phenomena, on what grounds do we ground our claims for the generalizability of our findings? And what is it that those who read our studies or hear them need to know that perhaps we don't normally include in our reports in order to answer the question, how seriously should I take this research report as guidance for the kinds of choices, decisions, judgments that I need to either make or perhaps more dangerously advise others to make that are going to have consequences for teachers and kids and communities and families. So that was the initial kind of contrast. Let me give a few more examples. One, much closer to home. Report in the Stanford daily, not the daily newspaper, but the Stanford Report, which does a really good job of reporting on some of the research that our colleagues do. And there was one that reported on a very lovely designed study that was done, I think, as a doctoral dissertation, but a couple of our colleagues on the faculty were named in conjunction with the study, Roy P., Paulo Blickstein, two very valued colleagues. And it involved a very small number, I think 28 undergraduates taking a new neuroscience course. Anybody remember that one? And they had half the students mess around with the materials first and then read the text on the neuroscience concepts. And the other group read the neuroscience stuff and then, as it were, do the lab. It was seen as an example of, here's a category, a meaningless category, a classroom. What the hell is a flipped classroom? As if that's a thing. That's as much a thing as a charter school, you know? No, very seriously. And the findings were that in this particular study, of this group of undergraduates studying a new neuroscience curriculum, with this particular kind of mess around first and then read as again, was evidence for the superiority of hands-on work before more formal study of text than vice versa. Okay, again, a lovely study. No complaints about the study. My complaint was about the inferential leap. Now, was it only the reporter's leap? Does the leap sit in the dissertation? Was our student encouraged to make that leap? Because if you don't make that leap, it's not a contribution to knowledge? I don't know. Did I have enough information about, what does it mean that it was a neuroscience lesson? I mean, many years ago, one of my doctoral students, Bill Carlson, who's a professor of science education at Penn State University, Mike, I don't know if you remember Bill, he did a dissertation on the teaching of biology in which he showed that the teaching of biology varied enormously within the same teacher, depending upon how well the teacher knew the particular concepts in biology he or she was teaching. And that for many teachers of biology, genetics was the great unknown, because it was so damn mathematical. And so they taught genetics really quite differently than they taught environmental science or organ systems. So what does it mean? The point was here again, this great inferential leap between the particular and the general. And the final example, again from the New York Times, was from about a year ago. And it was a report on a massive set of clinical trials on a medication that was targeted to cure neoblastomas. These are brain cancers that are very, very deadly. And again, a full-scale, double-blind clinical trial, thousands, maybe not thousands, hundreds, because it's not a widespread disease, but large enough samples. And the conclusion was no significant difference. And so the recommendation was take the drug off the market. Anybody remember that story? Yeah. But there was a hue and cry because a number of patients complained that they had been treated with this particular drug and had experienced dramatic improvement in their condition. And wasn't there a possibility that although the drug was not effective in general and for the most part, it was quite effective. It was quite effective for patients with certain kinds of characteristics under certain circumstances, and those findings were sitting in the data, but were going to be ignored by a strategy of analysis which was only looking for a single big main effect, which the drug house may have needed in order to get approval from the FDA to sell it for high prices broadly. But if I've got a neoblastoma, I want to know whether maybe this drug might be effective. And in fact, if you look at the way in which modern medicine is going, it's moving away from the notion of one size fitting all, and much more moving to the question of which kinds of interventions have which kinds of effects, under what kind of circumstances, for which sorts of patients. And often we're not even sure what we mean by which sorts of patients. And so is it DNA markers? Is it the kind of environment you've lived in for the last 30 years? Is it the family context in which you're in? Is it your stress levels? We don't know, which is why one of the recommendations of the person who led the study was the study wasn't a failure unless you framed it the wrong way. It's a great success if you ask, did it teach us anything? Are we smarter than they were before? The answer is hell yes. And can we build on it? So these were some of the things that are sort of knocking around in my head as I'm still thinking about Joe Doctor and his contribution to knowledge or lack thereof. And so I go back to Jerry Kagan. Generalizations are insidious. Any of you who would like to be able to connect to the full essay in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, he's written much longer essays about it as well, but this is enough, I think. I'd be happy to send it to you. Just describing in developmental psychology, which is his field, the extent to which generalizations about growing, developing kids break down constantly unless you subdivide them into talking about the hereditary differences among the kids and a whole bunch of other individual difference characteristics, not to mention the variations in culture in which they live. I realized, for example, kind of in introspecting, that, what Claude described, my work on pedagogical content knowledge, what it did was to take one feature of particularity, namely content, and say, look, you can't talk about what is good teaching unless you say the good teaching of what? Because you're going to get a different answer in talking about the good teaching of reading to 6-year-olds and the good teaching of AP Calculus to 11th or 12th graders. You're going to, but that's not enough either. What about cultural differences? What about contextual differences? What about other individual variations with regard to the kids? That PCK was only adding one C to the PK recipe. Teachers in classrooms are dealing with lots more than 2 variables at a time, which is why Lee Cronbach, in his later years, ended up writing a wonderful essay, and again, if you haven't read that one, you must, called, you assign it, Pam? She references it. She actually read it, I'm pretty sure. Called Prudent Aspirations for the Social Sciences, in which he described his own frustration in trying to develop a scientific basis for what he called aptitude treatment interactions. The interaction of kinds of aptitudes with kinds of treatments, with kinds of lessons or instruction. And he found that when he did it, he entered into what he called a hall of mirrors. Because what he was looking for was one-way interactions, then he got 2-way, then he got 3-way, then he got 4-way, then he got 5-way. You know what a 5-way interaction is? It's called a case study. But then again, Cronbach in that same essay called the 1990 National Census a case study. Well, it's a representation of the nation at a point in time, which doesn't fit it anymore, if you noticed. Anyway, what does all this mean? Does it mean that we are engaged in a fool's errand to try to do this kind of work? Absolutely not. Where we are foolish, I think, is in misframing what we do as an activity whose value increases to the extent that the broadest generalizations are possible, when in many of our fields, maybe most of them, the value of the broadest generalizations, I'm not saying they're without value, is far more limited than we're prepared to acknowledge. Let me give some practical kind of examples and advice. I always have to give advice. And then turn it over to my, you called them interlocutors?
I did.
Oh my goodness.
I thought that's what you requested.
I just said I wanted some people to share my sacrifice, that's all. So what are my suggestions? First of all, in terms of the design of our studies and our definitions of what counts as useful, important research. I think we have to design our studies under the assumption that what we are doing is necessarily being done in very, very specific settings with very specific groups of people, and that what we owe ourselves and those who read our work is as careful a description of those particularities as possible. It's like the ingredients. You know, you notice how all of us are reading the ingredients on processed food much more closely than we used to? You know, what's this chemical mean? No, but really, because we think it matters. Maybe it does, maybe, I don't know. But I read carbohydrate counts much more seriously than I ever did before, because I've reached an age and a state where that matters, okay? Well, what's the equivalent of how many grams of carbs you have in our descriptions of our research? If somebody else is going to ask you, this is something I want to eat and believe and use. And so one of the first things we need are some much better specifications of how to become more specific, of how to describe, because we have to assume that people can only use our work intelligently and responsibly if they know more than we usually tell them about the circumstances and people that we're studying. Pam, when you and Susanna did your work on pathways, the more you got into it, the more you found that it was very hard to generalize about genres of pathway, because the more you looked into a pathway into teaching, the more you found variations that may or may not be what explains why these teachers seem to be better at management. But I also, even though it was an econometric model in effect that you were using to describe the paths. Robert Merton talks about the importance of what he called theories of middle range rather than large theories. I would talk about theories of the local range. That we formulate our theories not in terms of broad generalizations, but about modest, prudent claims that we make for what it is we found. That shouldn't weaken the impact of our studies. I think it ought eventually to strengthen them, because we'll have a better idea of how to put studies together, of which ones can go together, of which ones can add up. Kenji, you've been studying bilingual curricula and teaching for years. And I think you've learned, as we've learned about charter schools, that bilingual education doesn't exist as a treatment. It's so many different, and for which kids, in which languages, in which communities. We need those kinds of reports that then get aggregated in different ways for different purposes, for different policy choices and what have you, in order to be doing evidence-based policy. Sam Weinberg has developed what he calls a series of heuristics for doing historical thinking. And I find 3 of his heuristics very, very provocative for thinking about using research. His most well-known heuristic is the sourcing heuristic. When you look at a piece of evidence that claims to be historical evidence, your first question should not be how persuasive it is in general, but who wrote it? Where did it come from? When? Under what circumstances? What did the source of this evidence have at stake when they produced the evidence, whether it's a diary or a painting or a letter or an editorial? What did it matter to them? A second heuristic Sam uses is corroboration. Are there other sources of evidence that somehow triangulate and either support the claim I want to make from this or temper it? he's got other heuristics, corroboration. Anybody student of Sam's here? Contextualization, thank you. That's been my message. Thank you, Joe. He carries Sam's message and improves it regularly. Sam told me that. Contextualization, corroboration, and sourcing. Now, what do I mean by you have to say something about what's at stake? I think just like the people who do drug research have to say if they're being supported by the drug house. Doesn't mean their research is bad, it's something I ought to know. Most of us who do research and education have skin in the game. We have something at stake. We care about what we're studying. And our readers ought to know that we care about it. Kenji, you care about bilingual competence and about two-language cultures. You care about it. Some people don't like it at all. They think it's un-American. I want to know that about your studies, and I want to know that about their studies. It ought to be just as transparent as I'm getting supported by Merck for doing this study on the Merck new drug. When I did my work on pedagogical content knowledge, I had something at stake. I cared because I wanted to be able to demonstrate that teachers had a form of knowledge that was greater than what mere professors of mathematics or of history had, even of English. That a teacher of English knew stuff. There was once a book written about this topic. No, it mattered, and you know what? People should have known that I cared about it when I was doing that work and when I was proposing these models, because I had skin in the game. The folks who do work on charter schools usually come in two genres, those who love them and those who hate them. Some of the most interesting studies of vouchers were dismissed at one point because the vouchers in New York City only seemed to have a big, whopping positive effect for black males among the high school students in New York City in the voucher experiment. And this was used to dismiss the results because if you recognize that, it didn't have a big main effect. Damn it, why was it so important for black males? Don't we want to know that? This is an important part of the population. We only dismiss the study if it turns out that there's something wrong with the precision of the measurements or what have you, or if we're looking for this broad generalization. There was gold in that study. It should have been followed up for its gold, not because there wasn't a huge whopping main effect. So the particularization doesn't ruin a study, it enriches it. I apologize for my passion. Anyway, let me end with a word about, first of all, my message to those of you doing work is that in all of our work, we must try to situate our studies much more clearly, much more clearly. We owe that to ourselves and to our readers and our colleagues, our peers. Second, we must be very prudent in the kinds of claims we seek to make about our findings. We have made some observations. The very ways in which we've made the observations are themselves theory-laden. We don't just look. And now we have inferences we make to explain the evidence. How are we making them? We have to contextualize, source, and to the extent that we can, or we don't, talk about corroboration. That's what the reviews of the literature ought to be about. They shouldn't be your second chapter. They should be your fifth chapter. Does anybody else have findings that are all like this? And what were the particularities of the studies that they did, and how do they connect or relate? And you have to be clear about whether you have skin in the game, because that's important too. You ought to have skin in the game. You ought to give a damn, but as your reader, I ought to know about it. I ought to know about it. I promise I'll finish in 2 minutes. the claim that we ought to have evidence-based policies and practices is a troublesome one, because the notion of evidence that normally pervades the field is what I call evidence sub one. It's the kind of evidence with regard to generalizability and general knowledge that I have tried to sabotage in the last half hour. But there are some ideas like it. There are some ideas that are in general more valid than some alternative ideas. It's important to know what they are, to use them when they're there, and to recognize their limitations. Evidence sub one, which is the results of general claims, are necessary when they're around, but very far from sufficient. Evidence sub two is evidence that is carefully particularized, situated, located, so that as readers, we know we are talking about the effect of vouchers on black males in New York City in 1999, I don't remember when the study was done, using the following kind of dependent measures, and on and on. And evidence sub two, I think, is even more important. But then there's evidence sub three. Evidence sub three is the kind of evidence that we have an obligation to collect in the course of engaging in any serious intervention. Sometimes we talk about formative evaluation. But it is the ongoing collection of data, making observations, looking at them carefully, modifying what we're doing. They're loosely called a design experiment approach, but that's a misnomer too. But evidence sub three is the evidence you gather in the course of actually doing the work you're doing. Mike, we used to talk about teacher research as that kind of activity. But it is an inquiry stance. It is the kind of work that the teachers in the writing project do, and constantly. That's also evidence. But it doesn't sit as the foundation of work so that you're building the skyscraper from this firm foundation. It's the scaffold that keeps the work going as you do it, because you need to understand and gather evidence from what you're involved with. So Alfred North Whitehead once said, "Seek generalizations and distrust them." And I would say, seek particularizations and try to learn from them. And I'm done. Thank you.
Lee, thank you very much. As promised, we have some interlocutors. 3 students from CTE have agreed to engage in conversation with Lee. I'd like to introduce first Jeremy Glazer, who's a first-year CTE doc student. Lorian Chambers-Schultz, 5th-year student, who is headed to a cushy job in Colorado. Lee made sure to ask her if she has skis, and you're well equipped for that. And Eddie Kachaturian, a 3rd-year doctoral student. And they have some questions and topics they'd like to put on the table.
Well, thanks for this opportunity, not just to think about your work in the long range, but to think about it today. As I'm quickly learning my first year, every time I get an assignment, it changes a little bit. So questions, comments. What I'll say is our questions are comments, which is, I want to hear more.
The fact is, do whatever the hell you want. Who's going to?
That's what I do. There's a wonderful quote. You quoted Cronbach saying, if we want to compare the camel with the horse, we compare a good horse with a good camel. We don't take 2 camels and saw the hump off one of them.
That was his critique of the typical experimental study. You're right.
So in an era where we seem to be generalizing the particular, erasing all particularities, giving value-added numbers to teachers, so people less and less of individuals, and continuing to slice the humps off camels, how does the kind of work that you're talking about become the gold standard, which is what you said you want it to be?
Did everybody hear his question? Okay. I'll give you an example from the meeting we had yesterday. I told you we were at a meeting to talk about redesigning aspects of the National Board portfolios. If you don't know about the portfolios, go and learn. Don't have time to talk about them now. But the question was, how do we build more evidence of student learning into a teaching portfolio, especially when we know damn well, the latest memo came from the American Statistical Association just a couple of weeks ago, that VAMs, value added measurement, are a totally inappropriate, unreliable metric for evaluating the impact of a teacher on students. So what do? If we also want, but we feel there's a moral obligation for those of us who train and evaluate teachers to hold all of ourselves accountable for our impact on kids. That's what we're here for. So we came up with a new idea. And you are the first group to hear it. It may not survive the report we wrote, but we are replacing VAMs, which are now to be considered toxic, non-kosher, disease-bearing, with labs. A lab is what a teacher will prepare as evidence for his or her impact on the learning of students in their context, their students, what they teach, etc. And it's called a learning added, not value added, but a learning added basket. Why basket? Because there is no single measure that reflects learning. That what we're dealing with is an aggregate, a combination. In fact, Pam, I'm shameless, I use chopped as my example. It's the ingredients that you put together to make the stew from which you're claiming that you added learning to the students. It must be accompanied by a conceptual explanation of why that is the case and why that works in this setting. If you're in a setting where you think that the VAM metric that's available belongs as an ingredient in your lab, fine, that's perfectly all right. Do you want to claim that you can smell the difference? That probably won't be on the list of acceptable ingredients. You know, you can't use anything you want in Chopped, right, Pam? Pam and I are Chopped fans. And so, but that's an example. An example would be shift from the general to a recognition of the power of particularity, especially in combinations, but always accompanied by an explanation of why this is evidence. My good and dear friend, Gary Fenstermacher, if you haven't read his work in the philosophy of education, you should, talks about the educational decisions we make, the term that Mike Atkin loves as well, as practical arguments. And he says, if you look carefully at what it takes to make a practical argument, the end of which is, what car should I buy? What school should I send my kid to? Which courses should I take at Stanford? They're not the result of syllogisms. They're the result of putting together what Fenstermacher and others in the field call the premises of practical arguments. Some of them are individual observations. Some of the results are big studies. Some of them are something your brother-in-law told you, etc. And you put them together into a practical argument that leads you to make a certain kind of judgment. Well, that's what a lab will be. And the alternative, by the way, is a LAP, which is a learning assessment profile. It also implies that this sort of thing is iterative. You run laps. You don't do it just once. But anyway, that's a practical example, and it's about as fresh as I can give you.
So my question is also around sort of the notion of generalizations. Clifford Geertz wrote, "No one lives in the world in general. Everybody, even the exiled, the drifting, the diasporic, or the perpetually moving, lives in some confined and limited stretch of it, the world around here." So in listening to sort of all of your examples from not just educational research, but around other fields and the New York Times. And so why is it that you think that humans move towards generalizations?
Well, I think we move toward generalizations, first of all, for the same reason that it really helps to speak the same language. E.D. Hirsch was right in saying that if we have some of the same concepts, it's a lot easier to live together in a civil democratic society because we can share some of the same analogies and metaphors and what have you. And I think that there are generalizations that are powerful. For me, the generalizations that are powerful are more likely to be conceptual than empirical. So, for example, again, Claude mentioned pedagogical content knowledge. What accounts for its traction? Why is it still being used, maybe more widely now than ever? Is pedagogical content knowledge true? I'm not sure what that means. Does it provide a set of lenses through which you can look at the world of instruction around you and see some things more clearly that you might not have seen before, and thereby include them in the questions you ask and the explanations that you offer? One of the most beautiful examples of that I know is work that was done by one of our late colleagues in science education, one of your dearest friends, Mike Atkin. That was Mary Budd Rowe. She was a colleague here at Stanford. She got her PhD here, Teachers College maybe. Didn't matter. Anyway, her big idea was instructional time, especially what she called wait time. The temporal gaps between teaching and learning events in a classroom. The time between asking a question and making a student answer it. The time between one student answer and another. Now, she made some big general claims from her studies about wait time. One of which was, as wait time increases, the conceptual depth, whether you use Bloom's taxonomy or something else to measure it, of the discourse in the classroom increases. Is that true? Beats the hell out of me. I suspect it's true sometimes. It's not true other times. It may be true in science classes for some things. I don't think it's true for the teaching of vocabulary and foreign language. Give me a lot of time. If I don't know the Spanish word for cyclosporin, it's probably cyclosporin, I'm not going to be able to think it through, reason about it. But the point is, but once she started publishing that work, all of us who educated teachers, all of us who teach, started seeing wait time in classrooms. Isn't that right, Julie? We started seeing classrooms in new ways. Some things became vivid, and we had more data. Why? Because that was a general idea. So I think we have to think about, and when we talk about generalization, about the generalizability of powerful concepts. What's the evidence base for claiming the generalizability of a concept in contrast to claiming the generalizability of a finding, of a claim about human nature or something like that? And my answer is, I don't know. That's such a hard question. I want this generation to wrestle with it. But I think that's why generalizations make life much easier to live. No, they do. Red means stop. Now, we were just in Shanghai for a week. If you've been in Shanghai, one of the things you learn is red doesn't mean stop to people driving cars, riding bikes, and motorbikes. Well, it's important to know in Shanghai, especially if you're a pedestrian. So was that responsive? Okay.
Feel free to follow up. The concept of interlocutor means you say something, he says something, you say something.
But we want to make sure Edith gets a chance to ask a question too.
I guess my question has to do with what all this means for kind of the future of educational research, the funding structures that exist for research, and as a budding researcher, what it means in terms of the kinds of methods that we need to learn.
Well, you'll notice I never once said anything about quantitative or qualitative research, because everything I've said applies equally to experimental and correlational studies, quantitative and qualitative. I mean, if the 1990 census is a case study, where the hell does the distinction go? So that's not the issue. I think it would mean that we select our problems to study around not the claim that when I'm done, the world will be permanently changed and for the better. But when I do this study, there's this piece of the world about which we don't understand enough under certain conditions with certain kinds of kids and teachers and what have you, that we will understand much more exquisitely. And this is why it's important to understand that. It's why I would encourage more often than we do now 4 and 5 dissertations to be yoked together and to be studying from a design perspective settings and kinds of kids. The relationships among provide corroboration opportunities. Or maybe even put together in the same study people with different skin in the game, people who have different policy preferences about bilingualism, about flipped classrooms, about you name it, about pedagogical content knowledge. And so I think we would not treat particularizations as the aw shucks move you make through data mining when you haven't achieved the results you really wanted to achieve, and see the particularization as its standard. I mean, my wife has just begun a treatment for leukemia that targets the particular cells that are afflicting her. That really is so much better than we have found that this cocktail of chemotherapies, in general and for the most part, this is so much more interesting and hopeful. I want to be able to say that about instruction. When Pam, you, and Deborah Ball and some others are talking about high-impact practices, you're not talking about general pedagogy. Now, you are trying to make generalizations across kids, and I don't think that as we do more studies of high-impact practices, even those will have to be nuanced and adapted in a variety of ways, and so will be the Breakstone-Weinberg heuristics, which we should begin calling them, right? Okay. Hey, listen.
Sam won't mind. I'm sure.
Listen, you put us on the edge of a cliff, let us go, take the work. No, but the point is, I think that's the kind of thing that we ought to be doing. Now, you raise a very important challenge, and it's one that I and Ari Kelman and some others who are working on the Jewish education program here at Stanford now have to deal with, which is re-educating funders. Very important, both government funders and foundations, which increasingly support a lot of our work. In my many years at Stanford, all of my work was supported by foundations, not by the feds who supported all of my work at Michigan State. The feds like the Big Ten, the foundations like the private universities. I hope that's changed. But the point is, we have to educate the funders. A lot of the program officers who work at those foundations got their PhDs with us. So maybe there's a hope. But we really have to see them as an audience for our work. And quite frankly, it's an audience that I'm going to seek out in the next few years for exactly the reason you implied. Because we don't want to do the right thing and have it unfunded, because those who control the ATMs think we ought to be using a different card.
Yeah, can I just ask one other question?
Of course, you can ask two.
I know that we have.
You have to ask several before you go off to Colorado.
It feels like what you're talking about are asking, being willing to look at at things that are much messier than we often try to make them. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the kinds of questions that will require asking, and whether that requires a shift.
You know what? I think I'm going to have to learn that from your generation in the next 5 years. We have lots of experience asking a certain kind of question. I just realized that I'm making the claim, to paraphrase something I read to you with some criticism, that messy questions make for inspiring and creative research designs. It is more messy. It is more messy because it means that our experimental designs, and by the way, I for one, not I for one, I think I'm among a knowledgeable group. I think we don't do experimentation often enough. I think we ought to be doing many more experiments because, as Francis Bacon observed just a few centuries ago, nature speaks to us much more eloquently when we vex it. It's much more interesting and enlightening to study things that are in a process of change, because change reveals things that stasis keeps camouflaged. But our experiments won't be as neat. They won't be an experimental group that gets the treatment and a control group that gets what we, in the technical language, call bupkis. Nothing at all. That won't be. I mean, as Cronbach, that lovely quote of Lee's that was in a book that I edited called Learning by Discovery, we have to stop doing experiments where we compare two camels, one of which has the hump cut off it. Instead of getting a really good camel and a really good horse, getting them both in motion, and then seeing under what circumstances which ones can do what for how long and to what end. And so I think we ought to be doing experimentation. I think that we should stop training doctoral students who only know either quantitative or qualitative methods. There is a very good reason why very, very, very few piano concertos have been written for one hand. They sound so much better played on the piano with two hands. And playing a violin with one hand is very hard. No, we've got this array of methods, and for people self-consciously to say, I'm only going to throw a curve, is crazy. So I think that the norm for research ought to be we use every possible method we can to make the data talk to us. We do whatever the hell we want with the data as long as we're utterly transparent as we write it up about what we did, on what basis, and to what end, so others can read what we did and say, I wouldn't do it that way, and I don't believe this at all. I say that about a lot of perfect experiments I read. Not because I don't trust the method, but because the treatment doesn't generalize to anything I care about. I don't care about messy desks that somebody sits in for half an hour in a lab. I may want to know what it feels like to live in one for several years. I do know what it feels like. And it ain't so bad as long as you can close the door.
Clearly it works.
It works. I don't know. You never know. There's no control person who, imagine if I had a clean desk, you know.
Great.
Anyway, other questions or comments?
Carl.
So, I'm going to push back a little.
Yes, we started this conversation a year ago at AERA.
So, you're talking about the, not generalizing. It actually reminds me of a conversation I had yesterday with a physics faculty member, which is very reminiscent of a few hundred such conversations I've had with policymakers and faculty. And, so it was a discussion about how to teach, this particular physics material. he was saying, and I was saying, look, we have, I don't know, somewhere between 50 and 100 studies that look at average student results and compare these things from all different institutions and say, this one's going to be superior. And he said, oh, but can't rely on that. They weren't in this particular course and with these particular students, so we should stick with what we were doing before. And so, I think, how do you avoid that very real risk?
I don't think you can avoid it. In other words, I think there will always be Luddites among us who think that smartphones are the latest curse that Satan has brought to the world. What's powerful, Carl Wyman, professor of education and physics, a man whose work I respect enormously, which is why you spoke at the centennial of the Carnegie Foundation at the Library of Congress, Carl. When you and I were at Michigan State a number of years ago, you were challenged on exactly those grounds by a professor of physics at Michigan State when you made a set of suggestions, proposals about improving the teaching of physics, which I thought were superb. And his challenge to you was, just a second, Professor Wyman, just because you have a Nobel Prize in physics, I should take your advice about teaching more seriously than my own experience? And your answer was, oh no, my Nobel Prize has nothing to do with the quality of my advice. I have dozens of experimental studies with data. And I thought we as physicists respected data, not opinion. And so I would say it doesn't, to me, weaken your claim to that colleague in physics if I say about your hundreds of studies, part of what makes them powerful in the aggregate is they weren't all done with your course to similar students in Boulder during the same year. But they were done at Maryland and at Stanford and at San Diego State and UBC and a number of other places with different kinds of students under different conditions, and certain kinds of general claims, and I would say they're general, emerge that suggest this is a really good general strategy. It doesn't tell you which simulations are going to work better than others. It doesn't tell you which particular assessments are going to be more sensitive than others, though your use of attitudinal assessments in addition to the cognitive assessments, I think is like grinding the lenses conceptually. It brings, so that would be my response.
But my challenge to you is you've talked about all of the dangers of overgeneralizing that we all know. You've talked about how wonderful it is to have this general thing you can believe in. You haven't told us how you decide which side of that line you're on, when you're safely one place or the other. That's I guess the way I would.
I guess I would say it depends what kind of skin you have in the game and who you're talking to. No, I'm very serious. I'm very serious. We are not only scholars, we are rhetoricians. We are change agents. And we all use data to support the arguments that we want to make. When you've done enough research in an area, you find yourself in a position that Jerry Bruner described beautifully in an essay whose title was Going Beyond the Information Given. The fact is, in any particular course that the physicist you were talking to wants to teach, there is no study that fits his circumstances exactly. We're always going to be going beyond the information given, and the question is the body of evidence sufficient for us to feel ethical and responsible in offering advice from the, what's the term used in law about evidence? It's the preponderance of the evidence. And I think the preponderance of the evidence is an interesting concept because it says that no single piece of evidence is sufficient to lock it down. It's not what we call in medicine a pathognomonic cue. You get finding, you know what you've got is lupus of this sort or something like that. It's the, and I think I don't think it's going to weaken our persuasiveness if we think about what we're doing as the preponderance of the evidence, or say, listen, friend, I've got evidence from Eric Mazur at Harvard teaching students, all right, not as smart as the Stanford student, okay, but similar students in a general course, etc., doing these things. Here are the specific characteristics of the students that we now have. Here's precisely what he did. You tell me if you aren't persuaded that this is something worth considering very seriously. Rather than, this is a general principle that's been written up in a general book called Cognitive Principles for Teaching Science, or something like that. I think we could be more persuasive. But yeah, I think it is the question is rhetorical. It's not scientific. Yeah, Mike?
You've left out a whole set of literature that I know you know well. You helped introduce me to it. That's exemplified by Martha Nussbaum's Non-Scientific Deliberation, by Shulman's Return to Reason.
Mm-hmm.
That literature, which speaks to me, the call of stories, Cole, that's a whole literature that doesn't fit comfortably within the scientific tradition you've been talking about here. So have you abandoned it, or where does it fit? Does it fit?
Mike, you know I will never abandon the importance of storytelling.
That's what I want to hear.
Yeah. No, I think I would agree strongly with Bruner's distinction between paradigmatic and narrative ways of knowing and the importance of both of them. There's a reason why I spent most of the last 30 years of my career doing research that was more narrative than paradigmatic, because I do find that a powerful way of knowing, but I find it, Nussbaum notwithstanding, just as insufficient as the nominally paradigmatic social sciencey ways of knowing. I find value in the social science ways of knowing. I often find that they are only of real value in application if they are joined by narratives of change or of learning. And my goal today was to talk about the paradigmatic stuff, and if you will, to cast some aspersions on the adequacy of those ways of knowing as they are normally construed. So, for example, if you look at econometric policy studies, or econometrically conducted policy studies, first of all, as I said in my little note, what could be more situated than a policy study? I mean, if a policy study is any good, it doesn't claim generalizability, or at least it shouldn't, because policies are by definition local, at a place and time, in a society, in a political culture. But anyway, just like the small print on the drug and food packages, you know what you find in all of those econometric studies? The same phrase, all things being equal. You look at all the VAM studies, all the value-added studies, there's an all things being equal clause in there. Such as, well, in order for this to work, we have to assume that all students learn at the same rate, you get the list, none of which can be supported. But somehow there's this magical incantation, all things being equal. And I guess the essence of my remarks today is not to say don't do this kind of work. I think they can give us a kind of broad sense of the landscape that could be invaluable, that can help us figure out where to look. Where is it worth looking better? You know? But the fact is, all things are never equal. Never. At the same time, and Carl's not here, but he could have followed up, and believe me, he will the next time we get together, by making the observation, but Lee, talk about a hall of mirrors. You've brought us into an absolutely endless ellipsis of inquiry. So where do we stop? You know, there's always one more variable, one more trait, one more construct, one more aspect of the situation. And my answer is practical. So I remember Ed Hartle, with whom I worked a lot on the creation of the National Board, once quoting the poet John Donne in response to the question, how do we know when we're done with our work in developing this utterly new, this was 1988, portfolio-based form of assessment? That was in many ways much more narrative than it was scientific, even though Lee Cronbach was, along with Hartle, our consultants on this. And he said, John Donne said, I have never yet finished a poem. I've just run out of time. So one of my other proposals would be that we change PhD programs. And we say a PhD program takes 4 years. Why should it take longer to create a PhD than an MD? And that's a year longer than a lawyer. 2 years longer than an MBA. Okay, we could call them a DBA, it wouldn't matter. They'd still screw up the environment, the ecology. Okay. No, the point is, we have to be prudent. You do the best you can, you don't drive yourself crazy, and you try to be more cognizant than many of us are about, you know, as I just said to Mike, there are things that I know I didn't include, and I just couldn't include everything. And when you do that, you also recognize that if taken out of context, you could be understood as dismissing or no longer believing in the importance of narrative forms of inquiry, which is far from the case. But
Could I ask you, you began your talk with the very provocative phrase by Jerome Kagan, that generalizations are insidious. Yet in the course of the conversation, in response to Carl's question and your comments now, you seem to admit to at least some utility for generalizations as a sort of a broad landscape, sort of laying out the topography. Would you be willing to accept a friendly amendment that generalizations are insidious if not thoughtfully applied?
yeah, I think that, look, again, Kagan, I think Kagan would be the first to say that. I think it is the cult of generalizability, the sense that where I started, which is that you haven't made a contribution to knowledge unless you've contributed to general theory. And that's where Kagan, I think, would say they're insidious. They blind us to so many things we could grow smart about if only we didn't think that was the only important thing to know.
But they're not inherently evil. It's in their use that they're insidious.
Oh, you sound like one of those Second Amendment guys who said there's nothing wrong with guns, just the bad guys who are using them.
Well, I'm a card-carrying NRA member. I'll reveal it here.
He's NRA, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Guilt by association always works.
No, I think it's a similar kind of problem. And that is that unless, look, not everybody who smokes dies of lung cancer. Does the generalization, it's better for people not to smoke, hold up? Yeah. Does that mean if you sneak out of here and smoke a cigarette today, you're going to die? No. In fact, you may avoid an anxiety attack. And that may be better for the world. I don't know, do you smoke?
No.
Okay. It may be.
I have a gun, but I don't smoke.
Yeah, okay. It may be better for the world if you smoke a couple of cigarettes a day and avoid anxiety attacks than if you go off entirely and your life is paralyzed by weekly anxiety. I mean, all I'm saying is that Kagan used purposely a provocative term. Look, Cronbach said generalizations decay. And what he meant by that is even when a generalization of a, contextualized in certain ways, is defensible, time is the great enemy of the general. I mean, we learned that in the 30s. All of you that are left here are too young to remember Dr. Spock, I think. Although many of you were raised by... Julie, do you still have a Dr. Spock? Is the baby being, which edition is the baby being raised? The newest baby?
It was my mom.
It was your mom, okay. Dr.
You're reading the
Spock,
Tiger book, right? The Tiger Mom.
the Tiger Mom?
Oh, sorry.
No, Tiger Mom is Asian mom, Jewish dad. No, these are all different. But see, these are all, there may be differences. But the point is that this Spock was a pediatrician who wrote the most widely read manuals on child rearing. The second edition was dramatically different from the first edition. And the best explanation was that the studies done he based the first edition on studies of child rearing and their consequences, as done in the late 20s and early 30s. Then his book was published. Millions and millions of moms, especially moms, raised their kids according to the dicta of Spock.
Dads do.
Did dads do it too? Okay. Some dads, many moms, who knows? The point was that it rapidly changed the patterns of child rearing in America. Denise, who knows if the seriousness with which people are taking your wonderful proposals about high school environments, about pressure and stress in kids, if these are taken up with a certain kind of vigor, regionally or nationally, 10 years from now, you may very well have to, you'll have new findings.
Retire.
No, I have to, Denise, what keeps me going is something that Dr. Ruth Westheimer taught me. Her son Joel was one of our doctoral students and postdoc with me. She said, Lee, you are not retired. You are rewired. You're rewiring, Denise.
Well, I want to thank someone who's helped rewire many brains in the field of educational research, and thank you to this legend for spending some time with us.
Thank you very much.
much.